The merciless Arizona sun of 1879 had turned the desert into a furnace that claimed lives without warning or mercy. For cattle rancher Thomas "Tom" Bradley, the discovery of a dying Navajo warrior beside his only water source presented a choice that would test everything he believed about survival, compassion, and what it meant to be human. In a land where water was more precious than gold and trust between cultures had been shattered by years of conflict, one cowboy's decision to share his last drops with a stranger would summon an ancient power that would protect his family for generations to come. Chapter 1. The Desert's Cruel Test. The Arizona sun hung like a merciless eye in the cloudless sky, its heat waves distorting the distant mountains into shimmering mirages. Thomas Bradley wiped the sweat from his weathered face as he approached the stone-lined well that represented the difference between life and death for his small cattle operation. The drought of 1879 had stretched into its fourth month, turning the normally green grasslands into a cracked wasteland that claimed livestock and tested the resolve of even the most experienced frontiersmen. Tom's ranch, the Circle B, sat in an isolated valley 30 miles southeast of Flagstaff, where the high desert met the edge of traditional Navajo territory. At 41 years old, he had spent the last 8 years building his modest operation through backbreaking labor and careful stewardship of the land's precious resources. His 100 head of cattle represented everything he owned in the world, and the well beside his simple adobe house was the lifeline that kept them all alive. As he drew closer to the well, Tom noticed something that made his blood run cold. A figure lay motionless beside the stone rim, collapsed in the meager shade provided by the wooden, windlass frame. The man's clothing identified him immediately as Navajo, the traditional woven shirt and leather leggings marking him as someone who had traveled far from the reservation lands to the north. Tom's hand moved instinctively toward the Colt revolver at his hip. The newspapers in Flagstaff regularly carried stories of Indian raids and settler conflicts, painting a picture of constant danger for isolated ranchers. Military patrols spoke of hostile bands roaming the territory, and many of Tom's neighbors had abandoned their claims rather than risk their family's safety. But as Tom approached cautiously, he realized this man posed no threat to anyone. The warrior appeared to be in his 50s, his long black hair streaked with gray, and his face bearing the deep lines that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. His lips were cracked and bleeding from severe dehydration, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that indicated he was very close to death. The man's eyes fluttered open as Tom's shadow fell across his face. Despite his desperate condition, those dark eyes held intelligence and dignity that commanded respect. When he tried to speak, only a hoarse whisper emerged, but Tom could see the plea for water written clearly in his expression. Tom knelt beside the dying man and assessed the situation with the practical eye of someone who understood desert survival. His own water supply had dwindled to less than 3 barrels, barely enough to sustain his cattle and himself until the next supply wagon arrived from Flagstaff in 2 weeks. Sharing even a cup with this stranger could mean the difference between his own survival and death in the unforgiving wasteland. Yet as Tom looked into the warrior's eyes, he saw not an enemy or a threat, but simply another human being facing the ultimate test that the desert imposed on all who dared to call it home. In that moment, the political tensions and cultural divisions that separated their peoples seemed less important than the fundamental question of what one person owed another in their darkest hour of need. Chapter 2. An Act of Mercy. Tom Bradley made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. Without another moment's hesitation, he lowered the wooden bucket into his well and drew up the precious water that represented his own survival. The dying warrior's eyes followed his movements with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe that mercy might exist in this harsh landscape, where survival had hardened most men's hearts. Kneeling beside the collapsed figure, Tom gently lifted the man's head and brought the wooden cup to his cracked lips. The warrior drank slowly at first, then with increasing desperation as his body recognized the life-giving liquid it had been denied for so long. Tom could see the gradual transformation as color returned to the man's weathered cheeks and strength began to flow back into his weakened frame. The process took nearly an hour, with Tom patiently offering small amounts of water while supporting the warrior's head and shoulders. During this time, he noticed details that spoke to the man's importance within his community. The silver bracelet on his wrist bore intricate designs that suggested the work of a master craftsman. The leather pouch at his side contained what appeared to be medicinal herbs and sacred objects wrapped carefully in soft deerskin. When the warrior finally had strength enough to sit upright against the stone wall of the well, he studied Tom with eyes that held newfound respect and curiosity. His first words came in heavily accented English, spoken slowly but with careful pronunciation that indicated formal education somewhere in his past. The warrior introduced himself as Joseph Begay, explaining that he was a medicine man of the Dine people, which the government called Navajo. He had been traveling alone across the desert when a sudden sandstorm had separated him from his horse and depleted his water supply. For 3 days, he had walked through the wasteland, following the ancient knowledge of water sources passed down through generations of his people. As Joseph's strength returned, he began to share fragments of his story with Tom. He spoke of the long walk, the forced relocation of his people to the Bosque Redondo Reservation years earlier, and their eventual return to their traditional lands. His voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the near destruction of his culture and the slow, painful process of rebuilding what had been lost. Joseph revealed that he served not only as a healer for his community, but as a keeper of the old stories and ceremonies that connected his people to their ancestors and the land itself. The herbs in his pouch were gathered for treating a sick child in his village, a journey that had become life-threatening when the desert claimed his supplies and mount. Tom listened to these revelations with a growing understanding of what his simple act of kindness had meant. In Joseph's culture, water was sacred, connected to life itself and the spiritual well-being of all creation. By sharing his water with a stranger, Tom had unknowingly participated in something far more significant than a simple rescue. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Joseph's recovery became increasingly apparent. The medicine man demonstrated his returning strength by identifying various desert plants around Tom's property, explaining their medicinal properties and their role in traditional Navajo healing practices. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, represented a wisdom about survival in the harsh landscape that Tom had never fully appreciated. Chapter 3: Bonds Beyond Words. Over the next 3 days, as Joseph Begay recovered his strength at the Circle B Ranch, an unexpected partnership began to develop between the two men. Despite the language barriers and cultural differences that separated their worlds, they discovered a shared understanding of what it meant to survive in the unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory. Tom found himself fascinated by Joseph's vast knowledge of desert survival techniques that had been passed down through countless generations of Navajo people. The medicine man demonstrated how to locate underground water sources by reading subtle changes in vegetation patterns, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for anyone traveling through the harsh terrain. He showed Tom which desert plants could provide emergency nutrition and which ones contained healing properties for treating everything from minor cuts to serious infections. In return, Tom shared his own hard-earned wisdom about cattle ranching in the high desert, explaining how he had learned to time his grazing rotations to preserve the fragile grasslands during drought conditions. Joseph listened with genuine interest as Tom described the challenges of maintaining a water source for livestock while balancing the needs of wild animals that also depended on the precious resource. What struck Tom most profoundly was Joseph's approach to the natural world around them. Where Tom had always seen the desert as something to be conquered or endured, Joseph revealed it as a complex living system where every element played a vital role in maintaining the delicate balance that sustained all life. The medicine man's reverence for the land was evident in how he moved through it, taking only what was needed and always giving something back in return. During the long evening hours, as they sat beside the well sharing simple meals of beans and hardtack, Joseph began to speak more openly about his role within his community. He described the responsibility he carried as a keeper of traditional knowledge, explaining how the stories, ceremonies, and healing practices of his people represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about living in harmony with the natural world. Joseph also revealed the personal cost of his position as a bridge between the old ways and the new realities imposed by the expanding American frontier. He had learned English as a young man when government agents had forced Navajo children into boarding schools designed to strip away their cultural identity. While this education had given him the ability to communicate with white settlers and officials, it had also placed him in the difficult position of translating between two vastly different worldviews. The medicine man spoke quietly about the ongoing tensions between his people and the territorial government, explaining how mutual misunderstanding and fear had created cycles of conflict that seemed impossible to break. He described young warriors who wanted to fight against the encroachment on their traditional lands and government officials who saw any resistance as justification for harsher measures against all Native Americans. As Tom listened to these revelations, he began to understand that his act of sharing water with Joseph represented something far more significant than simple hospitality. In Navajo tradition, Joseph explained, such kindness created a sacred obligation that connected not just individuals but entire families and communities across generations. The medicine man spoke of ancient ceremonies that recognized and honored those who demonstrated true compassion toward strangers, particularly during times of greatest need. According to these traditions, Tom's willingness to risk his own survival for a person he had never met marked him as someone worthy of the deepest respect and protection that Navajo culture could offer. On the third evening, as Joseph prepared to continue his journey back to his people, he performed a quiet ceremony beside Tom's well. Using sacred corn pollen and speaking words in his native language, the medicine man blessed the water source and asked the spirits of the land to watch over the man who had shown such kindness to one of their own. Chapter 4. The Quiet Departure. Dawn broke clear and cool across the Arizona desert as Joseph Begay prepared to leave the Circle B Ranch. The medicine man had regained his full strength and announced that he must return to his people to complete his mission of gathering healing herbs for the sick child who awaited his return. Tom understood the urgency, though he found himself reluctant to see his unexpected guest depart. Joseph spent his final morning at the ranch performing a ceremony that Tom had never witnessed before. The medicine man arranged small objects around the stone rim of the well, each item carefully selected from the leather pouch he carried. Turquoise stones, eagle feathers, and what appeared to be specially prepared herbs were placed at specific points, while Joseph chanted softly in his native language. The ritual lasted nearly an hour, with Joseph moving deliberately around the water source while speaking words that seemed to carry deep significance. Tom watched respectfully from a distance, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred even though he could not comprehend the specific meaning of the ceremony. The morning air seemed to shimmer with an energy that had nothing to do with the rising heat of the desert sun. When the ceremony concluded, Joseph approached Tom with a gravity that marked this as more than a simple farewell. The medicine man explained that he had performed a blessing that would connect Tom's water source to the spiritual protection of the Navajo people. According to ancient tradition, anyone who showed such kindness to a member of the dying during their time of greatest need would be granted the watchful care of the spirits that guarded their homeland. Joseph spoke carefully about what this protection might mean, though he admitted that its exact form would be determined by forces beyond his understanding. The spirits themselves would decide how best to honor Tom's compassion and ensure his safety in the dangerous frontier landscape. He warned Tom not to be alarmed if he noticed unusual signs in the days to come, as the spiritual world often made its presence known in ways that might seem strange to those unfamiliar with traditional beliefs. As Joseph gathered his few possessions and prepared for the long walk back to his village, he pressed a small object into Tom's palm. It was a piece of carved turquoise shaped like a water drop, polished smooth by countless hands and warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. The medicine man explained that this talisman had belonged to his grandfather and carried the blessings of many generations of his family. The two men shook hands in the manner of the white world, but Joseph also performed a traditional gesture, touching his heart, and then Tom's in a sign of respect that transcended cultural boundaries. As the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky, Joseph walked away from the ranch with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and how to get there safely. Tom watched until the medicine man disappeared among the distant rock formations, noting how Joseph seemed to blend naturally with the landscape, as if he were part of the desert itself. Only then did Tom notice that the objects Joseph had placed around the well remained in their careful arrangement, creating a circle of protection that would endure long after their creator had vanished into the wilderness. That evening, as Tom went about his usual chores of checking on his cattle and securing his property for the night, he found himself repeatedly glancing toward the horizons that surrounded his isolated ranch. Something in the quality of the silence seemed different, charged with an expectancy that made him acutely aware of being watched by unseen eyes. Chapter 5. The Silent Watchers Arrive. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains that evening, Tom Bradley noticed the first shadowy figure positioned on the ridge overlooking his ranch. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the fading light, perhaps a large boulder or twisted tree that his tired eyes had misinterpreted. But as the minutes passed, and the figure remained motionless yet unmistakably human in shape, Tom realized he was being observed. Moving to his cabin for his spyglass, Tom scanned the surrounding ridgelines more carefully. What he discovered made his breath catch in his throat. Dozens of figures had taken positions on the high ground around his property, each one maintaining perfect stillness while commanding a clear view of his ranch buildings and the approaches from all directions. The watchers appeared to be Navajo warriors, though they made no hostile gestures and showed no intention of approaching closer. As full darkness settled over the desert, Tom could occasionally catch glimpses of the silent sentries when they moved slightly or when starlight reflected off metal ornaments in their hair or clothing. They had positioned themselves with the tactical precision of experienced fighters, creating an invisible defensive perimeter that would detect any threat approaching the ranch long before it could reach Tom's property. The presence of the watchers filled Tom with a mixture of awe and unease. Joseph's blessing ceremony had apparently summoned this supernatural protection, but the reality of being surrounded by armed warriors, however benevolent their intentions, created a tension that made sleep nearly impossible. Tom found himself checking and rechecking his windows throughout the night, not from fear of the watchers themselves, but from the profound strangeness of his situation. By morning, the silent guardians had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared, leaving no trace of their presence, except for Tom's vivid memories and a deep sense that his world had fundamentally changed. The ordinary routines of ranch life continued, but with the knowledge that unseen protectors now stood watch over his isolated homestead, ready to respond to threats he might never even detect. Chapter 6. A Legacy of Protection. The Silent Watchers became a permanent fixture around the Circle B Ranch, though their presence remained largely invisible to Tom during daylight hours. Only in the evenings would he catch occasional glimpses of the Guardians taking their positions on the surrounding ridges, maintaining their ancient vigil over the man who had shown mercy to one of their own. Word of Tom's unusual protection spread throughout the Arizona Territory, carried by traveling merchants and government officials who witnessed the unprecedented sight of Navajo warriors voluntarily guarding a white settler's property. The phenomenon drew curiosity seekers and researchers, but the watchers remained completely focused on their sacred duty, never acknowledging the attention their presence generated. The practical benefits of this supernatural protection became evident within months of Joseph's departure. Cattle rustlers who had plagued other ranches in the region gave the Circle B a wide berth, somehow sensing that the isolated property was under powerful protection. Bandits and drifters who might have targeted a lone rancher chose easier prey rather than risk encountering the legendary Guardians. Tom's ranch gradually became known as neutral ground where disputes between settlers and Native Americans could be resolved peacefully. Government officials and tribal representatives would meet at his property to negotiate agreements, drawn by the unique atmosphere of trust that the Watcher's presence created. The story of his kindness to Joseph Begay had transformed Tom into an unofficial mediator between two cultures. Years passed, and the silent protection never wavered. When Tom eventually married and started a family, the Watchers extended their guardianship to include his wife and children. His descendants would inherit not only the ranch, but also the sacred obligation that bound the Navajo people to protect those who had shown true compassion. Tom Bradley had learned that in the harsh landscape of the frontier, the greatest strength came not from weapons or walls, but from a simple act of recognizing the humanity in every stranger who crossed his path. His legacy became proof that kindness, once freely given, could create bonds stronger than fear and more enduring than hatred. If Tom's story of courage and compassion moved you, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible true tales from America's frontier. Every like helps us share these forgotten heroes with the world.